Everyone refused to save the paralyzed alien warrior, except this human soldier. The docking bay of the outpost was a graveyard of discarded hope, but Nash moved through the shadows with a focused, heavy stride that vibrated through the metal flooring. "He is wasting resources on a corpse," the Hegemony overseer spat, his voice a series of dry, clicking sounds. Nash didn't look back, his broad shoulders tensed under a sweat-stained flight suit as he approached the medical pod where Aayla lay. She was a vision of fallen grace, her skin the color of deep twilight, now marred by the gray pallor of systemic failure. The explosion had severed her primary neural trunk, leaving her a prisoner in a body that had once led legions. Her eyes, wide and shimmering with a mixture of terror and terminal resignation, tracked Nash as he knelt beside her. "You are still in there, I can see it," Nash whispered, his voice a low rumble that seemed to anchor her to the physical world. He reached out, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made the alien overseer hiss in disgust. Aayla tried to speak, her throat working in a desperate, silent spasm, but only a soft, broken wheeze escaped her lips. "Don't try to move. Let me do the work for both of us," Nash murmured, leaning closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame. He began the first of the neuro-synaptic grafts, his hands moving with a fluid, rhythmic certainty that mocked the Hegemony's cold efficiency. The air in the small medbay grew thick and humid, charged with the sudden, sharp scent of sterile chemicals and the musky, pheromonal sweat of a human under pressure. He pressed his palm flat against her sternum, feeling the erratic, fluttering rhythm of her hearts, and for the first time in weeks, Aayla felt a spark of something other than pain. It was a grounding, heavy warmth that originated from his skin, a defiant pulse of life that refused to acknowledge her status as a broken thing. The weeks that followed were a blurred montage of agony and slow, erotic awakening as Nash pushed Ayla's body past its supposed limits. "Your people say you are done, but humans have a habit of fixing things that are supposedly beyond repair," Nash said, his breath hot against the sensitive curve of her ear as he lifted her from the biotank. He held her close, her slick, wet skin pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt, her head lolling against his shoulder. Aayla felt the vibration of his words in her own chest, a deep resonance that made her nerve endings shiver with newfound sensitivity. Nash didn't use a lift. He carried her himself, his muscles bunching and rippling with the effort, showing a physical dominance that was tempered by an almost agonizing gentleness. He laid her on the therapy table, his eyes dark with a hunger he couldn't entirely hide, though his focus remained on the surgical interface. "Does it hurt here?" he asked, sliding his hand down the length of her thigh, his fingers digging slightly into the muscle to check for a reflex. Aayla let out a sharp, gasping breath, her back arching instinctively as a bolt of electricity shot through her revitalized nerves. I felt that," she managed to choke out, her voice a raspy, melodic rasp that sent a jolt of desire through Nash's gut. He stopped, his hand lingering on her hip, his thumb tracing the sharp curve of her pelvic bone. "That's the human touch, Aayla. We don't just fix the wire, we fix the soul," Nash replied, his gaze locking onto hers with a fierce, possessive intensity. The room felt smaller, the lighting dimmed by the heavy atmosphere of their growing intimacy, the silence broken only by their synchronized breathing. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, the sweat from his brow dripping onto her cheeks like tears of fire. "You are going to walk, and then you are going to fly, and I'm going to be the one holding the tether," he promised, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate register. Progress was measured in the microscopic knitting of tissue and the deepening of the shadows under Nash's eyes. He spent his nights monitoring her vitals, often falling asleep in the chair beside her bed, his hand never leaving hers. Aayla watched him in the dim glow of the monitors, marveling at the sheer, stubborn endurance of the man. "Why do you stay when there is no profit in it?" she asked one evening, her voice stronger, carrying the lyrical lilt of her species. Nash looked up, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes burning with a steady, unwavering light. "Profit is a hegemony word. Aayla, humans work for things that can't be counted on a ledger," he said, standing up and stretching, his shirt riding up to reveal the powerful, scarred landscape of his torso. He moved to her side, his movements prowling and predatory yet entirely safe. "I stay because when I look at you, I don't see a broken warrior. I see the most beautiful thing in this sector," he confessed, his voice thick with a raw, unshielded honesty. He reached out, his fingers tangling in the silken strands of her hair, pulling her head back slightly so he could look into the depths of her eyes. Aayla felt a surge of heat in her belly, a liquid warmth that had nothing to do with her recovery and everything to do with the man towering over her. "I am a monster to my kind now, a defect," she whispered, her hand rising, trembling to touch the pulse point in his neck. "Then let me be your monster, too," Nash growled, leaning in to brush his lips against hers, a soft, teasing contact that made her vision swim. The kiss was a slow-motion explosion, a desperate reclamation of life that tasted of salt and longing. He moved his hand to the small of her back, the area where the grafts were most concentrated, and she didn't flinch. Instead, she pressed into him, her body seeking the solid, unrelenting strength of his, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The revelation came during a routine calibration of her neural link, a moment of vulnerability that stripped away their remaining defenses. Nash was deep into the code, his fingers flying across the holographic display, when the station's alarms began to wail. "The Hegemony is here. They've come to reclaim the scrap metal," the overseer announced over the comms, his voice filled with a malicious glee. Nash didn't panic. He simply looked at Aayla, who was struggling to sit up, her eyes wide with the realization that her death warrant had been signed. "They won't take you. I've hard-coded your neural signature to my own biometrics," Nash revealed, his voice calm, terrifyingly so. Aayla froze, the weight of his words sinking in. You bonded your life force to mine," she breathed, realizing the true extent of his medical intervention. "If they take you, they have to kill me, and humans are notoriously hard to kill," Nash said. A grim smile touching his lips as he reached for a heavy pulse rifle leaning against the wall. He turned back to her, his gaze sweeping over her body with a look of fierce, protective ownership. "I didn't just fix your spine, Aayla, I gave you a piece of my own nervous system," he explained, his hand moving to the interface port at the base of his own skull. "We are physically linked now. Your pain is mine, your strength is mine," he added, the sheer audacity of the human technology leaving her breathless. The door to the medbay hissed open, and the first of the Hegemony enforcers stepped through, their weapons leveled. Nash didn't hesitate, his movements a blur of practiced, lethal efficiency as he put himself between the soldiers and Aayla. "She is under Terran protection, and I am the wall you have to climb," he roared, the sound echoing through the small room like a thunderclap. The battle for the medbay was a chaotic, high-stakes dance of violence and tactical genius. Nash moved with a heaviness that was deceptive, his strength allowing him to wield weapons that would have required a tripod for any other species. He used the environment to his advantage, detonating cooling pipes to create a thick, obscuring mist that only he, with his thermal-augmented goggles, could see through. Aayla watched from the bed, her mind flooded with the sensory input of Nash's own combat adrenaline. She could feel the surge of his heart, the tightening of his muscles, the sharp, metallic tang of his aggression. It was a feedback loop of human ferocity that began to jumpstart her own dormant warrior instincts. "Aayla, I need you to focus. Use the link," Nash shouted over the roar of gunfire, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. She closed her eyes, reaching out through the neural bridge he had built, and suddenly she could see the room through his eyes. She saw the enforcer flanking him from the left and felt the instinctive twitch in Nash's trigger finger. "Left, high!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the din. Nash spun, his rifle barking a rhythmic cadence of destruction, the enforcer falling before he could even register the threat. They were a single entity, a composite being of alien grace and human brutality, tearing through the Hegemony's best with a terrifying ease. Nash fought his way back to her side, his armor scorched and his face streaked with blood, but he looked more alive than she had ever seen him. "That's my girl," he panted, reaching out to squeeze her hand, his touch sending a jolt of pure, unadulterated power through her system. He pulled her into his lap, using one hand to hold her and the other to keep the door suppressed, the heat of his body acting as a shield against the cold reality of their situation. As the immediate threat was neutralized, the tension shifted from the external to the internal, the air between them vibrating with the aftermath of the fight. Nash set the rifle down, his chest heaving as he looked down at Aayla, who was now clutching his tactical vest with surprising strength. "You fought for me, truly fought," she whispered, her eyes searching his face for any sign of regret. I'd burn the whole galaxy for you, Aayla. Don't you get that yet? Nash replied, his voice a low, dangerous growl that made her blood hum. He leaned down, his mouth finding the sensitive skin of her throat, his teeth grazing the pulse point there in a move that was both protective and deeply carnal. Aayla let out a low, vibrating moan, her hands sliding up his arms to feel the massive, knotted muscles of his shoulders. The link. It's not just for combat, is it? She asked, her breath hitching as she felt a wave of his desire wash over her like a physical weight. Nash pulled back just enough to look her in the eye, his expression one of raw, hungering need. No, it's for everything. I want you to feel what I feel when I touch you, he said, his hand sliding under the thin medical gown she wore, his palm hot against her stomach. Aayla gasped, her head falling back as the neural connection amplified the sensation 1,000-fold. It was an intimacy beyond anything her species had ever conceived, a total merging of two distinct biological signatures. She could feel his appreciation for the curve of her waist, the texture of her skin, and the fierce, protective love that fueled his every breath. "Show me," she urged, her voice a desperate plea, her fingers digging into his back. The transition from the medbay to a more secure, private quarters was a blur of heavy lifting and whispered promises. Nash settled Aayla onto the wide, firm bunk, his movements efficient but loaded with a heavy, simmering anticipation. "This isn't standard medical protocol," Aayla teased, though her voice trembled with excitement. "Human medicine is holistic. We treat the whole body, especially the parts that crave touch," Nash replied, his voice a dark, velvety rumble as he began to strip off his combat gear. He stood before her, a mountain of a man, his skin a roadmap of scars and muscle, illuminated by the soft, blue light of the cabin. Aayla reached out, her fingers tracing the jagged line of a scar across his ribs, feeling the hum of his nervous system through the link. "You are so substantial," she murmured, her gaze traveling up to his broad chest and the thick column of his neck. Nash moved onto the bed, his weight making the frame groan, his presence filling the small space until there was nothing else in her universe. He hovered over her, his hands pinning her wrists gently above her head, his eyes locked onto hers with a possessive fire. "I'm going to make you forget that you were ever broken," he promised, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He began to kiss her, not with the tentative softness of before, but with a deep, demanding hunger that claimed every inch of her. The neural link translated his passion into a symphony of sensation that bypassed her damaged nerves and went straight to her core. She felt the weight of him, the heat of him, and the absolute, unwavering certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Their union was a celebration of human ingenuity and alien resilience, a physical manifestation of the bond Nash had forged in the lab. As they moved together, the neural bridge carried the feedback of their pleasure, creating a loop of escalating intensity that threatened to overwhelm them both. "Nash, I can feel your heart," Aayla cried out, her voice breaking as she felt the rhythmic thud of his blood pumping in sync with her own. "That's the human spirit, Aayla. It never gives up and it never lets go," Nash gasped, his face buried in the crook of her neck, his body tense like a bowstring. He moved with a powerful, rhythmic drive that forced her to stay present, to feel every nuance of their connection. The air in the room was thick with the scent of their combined heat, a heavy, primal aroma that spoke of survival and conquest. Aayla felt her paralysis not as a limitation, but as a blank canvas upon which Nash was painting a new existence. Every touch was a reclamation, every kiss a defiance of the hegemony's cold logic. Nash's strength was her strength, his life force the engine that now drove her own. In the peak of their passion, the neural link flared white-hot, a blinding connection that momentarily fused their minds into a single, soaring consciousness. They were no longer human and alien, doctor and patient. They were a new species, born of human compassion and the refusal to accept the impossible. Nash held her through the aftershocks, his massive arms a fortress around her, his breath finally slowing to a steady, rhythmic pace. "You're mine now," he whispered into the silence, his voice a vow that resonated through the very metal of the ship. The aftermath of their bonding brought a new clarity to their situation, the reality of the galactic political landscape crashing back into their private sanctuary. The hegemony wouldn't stop at one failed retrieval. They would send a fleet to reclaim the property Nash had stolen. "We can't stay here. The outpost isn't safe," Aayla said, her voice steady as she sat up, the grafts in her back glowing with a faint, healthy light. "I've already signaled the Terran Vanguard. They're 3 parsecs out and moving fast," Nash replied, his hands already busy with the controls of the room's tactical terminal. He looked at her, a prideful smile touching his lips as he saw her moving with increasing confidence. "You're walking better already," he noted, his gaze lingering on the graceful lines of her legs. "I have a very motivating therapist," she countered, her eyes sparkling with a renewed sense of purpose. Nash stood up, his posture projecting an aura of unshakable command that had earned him his rank in the first place. "They think they can just take what they want because we're soft humans," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "But they forgot that we're the ones who learned how to restart a heart and rebuild a soul," he added, his eyes turning toward the viewport where the stars beckoned. He moved to her side, offering his hand, and she took it, her fingers interlacing with his with a strength that was entirely her own. "Let's show them what a human and his warrior can do," Nash said, his voice filled with a grim, joyous anticipation. They walked toward the door together, a unified front against a galaxy that had tried to throw them away. The final confrontation took place in the narrow corridors of the docking bay, where Nash and Aayla stood as the last line of defense. The Hegemony commander, a towering figure of chitinous armor and cold intellect, stepped forward, his eyes clicking in confusion. "The defect should not be standing. What have you done, human?" he demanded, his voice a harsh rasp. Nash didn't answer with words. He simply tightened his grip on his pulse rifle, his body a solid, immovable block of Terran steel. Beside him, Aayla moved with a fluid, lethal grace, her own weapon leveled with a steady hand. "She isn't a defect, she's an upgrade," Nash finally said, his voice echoing with a fierce, possessive pride. He signaled the Terran ships, and the station groaned as the Vanguard's docking clamps engaged, the sound a herald of the human cavalry. The battle was short and decisive, the Hegemony's rigid tactics no match for the adaptive, chaotic brilliance of the human-led defense. In the quiet that followed, Nash turned to Aayla, his face illuminated by the flickering lights of the bay. "You're free, Aayla, really free," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She didn't speak. She simply stepped into his arms, burying her face in his chest as the weight of her journey finally hit her. "I was never broken, Nash. I was just waiting for you to find the pieces," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic trill. Nash held her tight, his gaze fixed on the stars, knowing that their story was just beginning. They were a testament to the fact that in a cold, calculating universe, the most powerful force was the heat of a human heart that refused to let go. As they boarded the Terran cruiser, the galaxy watched, beginning to understand that to touch a human was to invite a storm, and to love one was to change the course of history. Nash and Aayla walked into the future, their steps synchronized, their souls forever bonded by a link that no alien power could ever sever.